right, Brian, I guess we ought to jump back into some wrestling talk. And of course, the A&E biography series for this season, at least, closed up this past Sunday night with a biography of the very first WrestleMania, 1985. And I liked some parts of this program, and the old footage usually, obviously, is fun to see. I disliked other parts, but I knew they weren't going to be in depth about, a variety of the failure aspects of WrestleMania. And now somebody's going to say, oh, goddamn, he thinks WrestleMania is a failure. No, I'm talking about the things that actually did go wrong leading up to the first WrestleMania. As we know now in hindsight, it turned out all right. But it was odd. I wrote down as soon as the show started, I can tell this is going to be a lot of self-back-patting and a lot of blowing of Hulk Hogan. And it was. But the whole concept was that Vince McMahon had bet the farm on WrestleMania, had mortgaged everything that they owned. He was going to go out of business the next day if this thing wasn't a success, which there was an element of truth to that. But then they proceeded to build it up in such a way that by the time they were finished with it, you thought, well, this can't miss. This is the closest thing to a sure thing we've ever seen. How in the world would this not come off well? So they kind of shot themselves in the foot in, at least for their narrative, not creating a little more jeopardy on poor old Vince's business and company going into the thing before it was a raving success. Do you see that aspect of it, what I'm saying?
All things considered, this was one of the better jobs they did of managing the bullshit WWE narrative while still maintaining it, but not being completely offensive, but just carefully omitting every key thing that needs to be included.
Well,
what did you think of the whole segment they did on Belzer? I thought it was so interesting.
I made a note about that. That's the only clip that they didn't show of that press tour.
They also, the other thing I think, I'll throw it out here now. I was going to make another joke. What about the section about David Schultz? 2020. That's the thing with WrestleMania, the month and a half, 2 months leading up to it, it was MTV, it was 2020, and the night before Mania, Hogan almost kills Richard Belzer on fucking live TV. And then it's Saturday Night Live as a last-minute replacement. But when that was still a big deal the night before Mania, everything was working perfectly. Again, Vince, during that period of time, they didn't bring this up. $1 million from Antonio Inoki, booking fee. $1 million from Jim Crockett to sell him back the time slot he was about to get kicked off of. So a lot of things they left out.
And that's what financed WrestleMania. But as they started off, they were telling the story of, the old time, it was the territory days. And Jimmy Hart, they used him for that. He gave the Memphis territory schedule. They had some cool B-roll of like a Louisville newspaper ad and
a photocopy of one. Yeah, someone got a Terry Justice bulletin, cut that out, and put it on a fake bulletin board.
And Stephanie went way overboard on the makeup on this one. She was trying to eye makeup Ronda Rousey on this one. But the old early 80s footage is always fun to see. And, Hogan said it was a perfect storm, brother. And it was kind of, because the one thing that I do agree with him when he said transitioning from Bob Backlund as champion to him was like going from black and white to Technicolor. It is like when Dorothy steps out of the house and she's in Oz, and as soon as she opens the door, boom, because I like Bob Backlund as a person, and he was a entertaining heel in the modern era, and he's a legitimate athlete and a shooter as a wrestler, but as a babyface especially, he was the most boring champion that I can think of in territory wrestling history. I mean, just not just boring, but just the goody two shoes, the baby face. I mean, it was New York and Philadelphia, for God's sake.
It worked for a few years. You can't deny it.
And then the last couple years, it was starting to, the custard was starting to turn a bit. So going from Backlund to Hogan was an opportunity for everybody to go, holy shit. And yes, Hulk Hogan did draw a fortune, but God, is he an insufferable douchebag about it. Yes, I saw that it was an opportunity for me to create, this and cure cancer and etc. What?
Another one of those things that's probably not said enough, and it was certainly not said here, and it certainly wasn't heard here, but what a big part of his whole package, Eye of the Tiger, was at that time.
Yeah.
Because no one had music. I mean, when I say no one, I mean, not that many guys did, and in the Northeast, Sergeant Slaughter did. Like, you know what I mean? And that was military music.
Yeah, well, let's think about this. Music in wrestling in general. We've talked about, Michael Hayes once say, well, the Freebirds were the first. Well, Bad Leroy Brown is calling. And then there was Chris Colt with the Alice Cooper music in 76. And I mean, it was Gorgeous George in the 50s with Pomp and Circumstance. But in the 80s, I guess really Memphis, again, started the trend. When did they start using music for the Von Erichs in Dallas?
82. Well, 82 is when 81, I would probably say, actually. 81, at least.
Because Kevin had Stranglehold.
Yeah.
Kerry had Tom Sawyer.
That's right.
The Boys as a group used LaGrange, right? Or was that David first?
That was the three of them. I don't remember, actually, if that was David first.
But nevertheless, and in Memphis, you had the Fabulous Ones. Lawler obviously had been using music, especially for his big entrances, for a few years. Then the whole MTV thing blew up, and that's what...
JYD, don't forget.
JYD, obviously, in Louisiana. But it was the early 80s, and even though some of those things predated MTV just slightly, that was a big point of this program, was that we've never looked at that from the MTV side. We always looked at it from the wrestling side. He got on MTV. MTV, according to not only David Wolf and who was that?
Les Garland.
That was Les Garland. But I was going to leave him for last. But
Alan Hunter.
What's his last name? Alan Hunter.
Alan Hunter.
Blanking on Hunter. One of the VJs, and then Les Garland, who was the head of MTV. They were fucking over the moon about this. It was their best ratings they had ever done by multiple times when they did these crossover shows. So it actually, a lot of people in wrestling have given credit to MTV for the success of of WrestleMania, the War to Settle a Score, Brawl to Settle It All, and just that whole rock and wrestling connection.
MTV and Dick Ebersol.
Yeah, well, there's the people at MTV saying that wrestling is what I Want My MTV promotion and the Rock and Wrestling Connection, they credited as the two biggest things that got MTV over. And again, and they said this on the program, a lot of people now are going, wait a minute, what, MTV, fucking Teen Mom or whatever? No, when they played music videos, when they first went on the air, it was the goddamnedest, hottest thing on cable. Everybody loved the MTV, including me. I used to have Mike Duncan, because he had cable in Nashville before we had it here. I used to have him do 6 hours on VHS, just stick a tape in and roll it, bring it to me next week. But it was as important for MTV as it was for wrestling. And if you look at it, and you just mentioned all those things that were happening all at the same time. Hogan and Rocky III, and the music, the entrance, the MTV crossover.
Yeah, and that's another thing. JYD had Another One Bites the Dust, and the Von Erichs had their songs. Eye of the Tiger was a fresh hit.
Yeah.
Rocky III was fresh on everyone's mind when when Hogan was coming out to it, and everyone knew him from the movie. I mean, go watch the early reactions he got when he came back to New York. It's insane.
Yeah, and that's the thing. All those things that you mentioned, and that giant media tour, those are the things that tipped the war to Vince McMahon over Jim Crockett Promotions if you look at it, because not only were the WWF guys everywhere on mainstream television shows and doing personal appearances, and then the whole MTV thing, and they've got celebrities, and it was new then. And they were celebrities. This wasn't, Pamela Anderson. This was fucking Muhammad Ali, Liberace, for fuck's sake. Big names. And, Crockett couldn't compete with that. He didn't have the infrastructure. He didn't have the media connections. He didn't have the people that could get booked on, or the people that could book his people. He had Flair, he had Dusty, the Road Warriors, all these personalities. But we were doing, morning fucking drive radio in Raleigh. The Midnight Express and I got on MTV one time, in 1989. WCW, TBS worked it out. That was way too late. Crockett didn't have that. The wrestling was competitive. The talent was competitive. The ratings in the houses in a lot of cases were competitive. But goddamn Vince's business blew Crockett out of the water. And
he's getting the teens with MTV. He's
tons of new fans.
Developing the cartoon for the youngest kids on CBS on Saturday mornings at the same time. He has the action figures getting ready to be put out.
Get them early.
Jeff Otto years ago on 605 talked about the fact that they were so strapped for cash. The week of WrestleMania, they called up and tried to make a deal to sell the video rights. I forget what it was. It was like $100,000. You can get all the video rights in perpetuity. And
Jesus Christ.
That's how desperate they were. That was before they made the deal with Coliseum Home Video.
Well, that was the thing. He was trying to get there and get that revenue. And the $1 million from Inoki, the $1 million from Crockett, that carried him that far. And it still wasn't, a guaranteed deal.
But let's talk about how Vince was spending, too. We're talking about all this money coming in, and they were making lots of money, too. But at that point, he's paying for TV across the country because of deals that he tried to screw the other promoters out of. He's paying for buildings, obviously. He has the biggest roster he may have ever had. They were running 4 shows a night at various points. They had 4 teams a night. Think about that. So that's a lot of people you're paying. He's aggressively trying to go into every single market all at once.
Well, he did that on cash flow.
Yeah.
And now in hindsight, he did the whole thing on cash flow. If WrestleMania had not come through, he wouldn't have been able to pay all that shit back or pay it off. But yeah, they were everywhere. And
they didn't say WOR either. They talk about TBS, they talk about USA, they never say WOR.
Well, that was the thing again. So we're expected to believe that Vince invented wrestling on cable. Once we got on cable, ignoring the fact that obviously Georgia Championship Wrestling had been on TBS since it had been on cable, they showed Vince the first day on TBS. Hello and welcome to, but not him being forced to sell the time slot to Crockett for the $1 million after the viewers rioted practically from their homes and demanded their Gordon Soley wrestling back. And it was the same thing when they started talking about closed circuit. They were saying, well, everybody thought Vince was crazy. Closed circuit, nobody's going to go to a movie theater or an arena and watch an event on a big screen. What?
You know who was booked on this show? Muhammad Ali. You know how many closed circuit extravaganzas he headlined in the 70s?
Since the early 60s. There was closed circuit broadcast of Clay and Liston in 64. Boxing had been doing the exact same thing for 20 years. Wrestling had done it in Los Angeles in the 70s when they were on the hot streak with Blassie and Tolos, and Starrcade, which started in 1983, was doing closed circuit first in the Carolina territory, and then by 85 they'd expanded to the Northeast, and I think they even closed circuited to Puerto Rico. And so, yes, the WrestleMania 1 had more closed circuit locations booked originally than any other wrestling show ever had. I think they had, at least 150 of them booked at the start, but they also, whereas some of them were tremendously successful, because of poor advances or just the stench of grisly death, they canceled before the event happened a bunch of the closed circuit locations so that they wouldn't have to, they could at least save some money at that point because they were trying to tighten things up at the last minute. So yes, it did do great on closed circuit. It didn't, I think they had a newspaper article that said 1 million people watch WrestleMania on closed circuit TV. I don't think that was the case. Even a few 100,000 made a lot of money, but let's be real here. So he didn't invent closed circuit for wrestling or boxing or whatever. And nobody thought that it was crazy to do that because people had been doing that for 20 years beforehand. That's how I saw Ali and Inoki, which, by the way, Vince helped promote. So
yeah, they bring up Evel Knievel. They never bring up that.
Yeah. And he lost more money on Evel Knievel than he did on Ali and Inoki. But anyway, so except for the fact that, again, Vince wasn't the first wrestling on cable TV, and he recognized the value of it, but he wasn't the first, and he recognized the value of closed circuit television on wrestling or boxing, but he was not the first by 20 years in either sport. But he did it most successfully. I did make one odd note. Brutus Beefcake now weighs 350 pounds. What the fuck happened? Did you see? He's got a double face.
Well, he spent a lot of time cutting and strutting and snorting.
No, you don't get that fat from snorting. And if he was cutting, he should have been cutting carbs. So anyway, and yes, as you mentioned, they did skip over the Richard Belzer incident, but that did make every newspaper in the world. So this massive PR tour, they were everywhere, including Saturday Night Live the night before. And it all fed into the show that day. And that was, Madison Square Garden was already going to sell out because it was a big show that was promoted, and the Garden did sell out in those days. But the last week or so, I think, made a big difference. And
Billy Martin, remember, they talked about Billy Martin being there. Billy Martin, that's 85. Billy Martin just got brought back. Yogi Berra got fired at the beginning of the 85 season for the Yankees, and they brought Billy Martin back as the manager of the Yankees right after this.
Okay.
Not that you care, but he was
I don't care.
Notorious drunk. There's a great biography by Bill Pennington about Billy Martin out there.
But I thought Liberace was a bigger name than Billy Martin.
In 85? Well, in New York in 85, I don't know. Liberace was actually playing in New York then, but we're talking Billy Martin in New York. Billy Martin was there for New York. That's why he was there. That's why.
Yes.
It really is, of all the WrestleManias, it's the most New York-centric WrestleMania, even like in the build-up to it. Belzer, Saturday Night Live, the different things you see from the street, like things that they filmed. It's a very New York-centric WrestleMania.
Well, okay, now, how about this? Speaking of New York, did the crowd at WrestleMania 1 look like any crowd you've seen at a New York wrestling show in the last 15 years?
Well, I haven't been to too many New York wrestling shows in the last 15 years.
Well, okay. There were real people in the crowd. There were normal people. There were women. There were kids. There were old people. There were black and white and Hispanic. It was not all 20 to 40-year-old guys in black T-shirts with bald heads and beards.
No, that's actually, the period of time you're talking about is a really interesting period. This period right here, 84 into 85, maybe even into early 86, because it's kind of the death of... What you have there is a true mixture, because you have the people who have been coming to MSG for years and like the action and get into it. The working class New Yorkers who soon get priced out of a lot of those seats.
Yeah.
But they're still coming. And you know what? It may not be exactly what they want, but hey, Bruno's still showing up. Different people are there. They could still get into it. Then you have the new people that are showing up. And especially in New York, right around that period of time in early 85, it was trendy to be there. especially a little bit afterwards. Still, you have kids all of a sudden being brought by their parents. But pretty soon that starts pushing out the working class fan who is coming. But that's like the last period of time in New York where you get a real good mixture of an excited audience where it's just across the spectrum.
Yeah. And it looked like a wrestling crowd, like the crowds had looked in wrestling for the previous 50 years. And then suddenly by in New York in 5 or 10 years, it completely changed. And all those people were run off and it was a completely different audience.
If you go watch an MSG show from like 81 or 82, go find the most boring matches on the show. Something with Baron Cicluna or something with Baron Cicluna.
There you go.
Go find one of the most boring match in the show and then go find a mid-card match from like 87, 88. The crowd noise is totally different. The crowd energy is totally different. The crowd lighting is totally different. And that's when they just made things completely dark at that point. But there was a big change in the fans in New York and the Garden going to shows between the early 80s and the late 80s. And that mid-80s period is the time where everything switched.
Yeah. And well, there was a switch everywhere. I even saw it after Crockett sold to TBS. You could see it with the WCW crowds. And it wasn't a cross-section of everybody. It wasn't regular people anymore. It wasn't old and young and different generations and black and white and guys and girls and all mixtures. It was starting to be the crowd that you see at a wrestling show. And a very specific type and age range and the whole 9 yards. And they calmed down. Because as you mentioned, you watch Baron Cicluna, people are going insane for the man from the Isle of Malta. And 15 years later in the same building, guys are fucking doing diving headbutts off the top rope and people are going, But anyway, so they went through the matches on the card on the special, just, highlights. And at that point, you remember that almost every match on the card was fucking rotten. Which, again, WrestleMania being a destination for these great matches was not a thing at that point. It wouldn't be a thing they were worried about, is it going to sell or people going to buy tickets? Not anything about the match quality. It was, and that's the thing.
And the fans didn't care about the match quality.
The fans did. Well, I mean, the old New York fans, the old WWF fans, they'd kind of, realized that's what it was going to be. And they didn't see a lot of other wrestling at that point. Even in New York where the Florida show was on, but not as many people watched it because it wasn't the local thing and it was late at night on the Spanish station or whatever. But the matches never meant a ton in the WWF. It was the gimmicks and the angles and the matchups. And that's what it was here. And you see, the talking heads that were kids then at the first WrestleMania saying, oh, the Iron Sheik was so over and Sergeant Slaughter and Nikolai, because it was all of their gimmicks. The Iranian menace and the Russian guy that sang the anthem. And so they weren't going for the matches. They were going to see what happened and they were into the guy's gimmicks. And that's Vince's, that's his style. That's his style of presenting wrestling is the sizzle instead of the steak and the gimmicks and get them into the personalities and sell the merchandise. But, the matches did get better, but they didn't on that particular night. It was so heartwarming to hear that Stephanie was nervous for her friend Andre, that if John Studd body slammed him, he'd have to retire.
He would have been yelling from the ring, "Where's Stephanie?" Ah!
So, and Hulk had tried to tell us that he was afraid that Mr. T would chicken out and leave the building, so he kept his eyes on him. I don't think Mr. T was leaving the building at that point before he got that payoff.
This is a story he's told several times, the idea that, and I don't know that it's been completely dismissed, the idea that Mr. T got real nervous before this. Again, there was a lot of real life shit going on with Mr. T and Piper.
Yeah.
And Orndorff wasn't much better. So let's be honest that he may have been a bit nervous about doing this. So there's some element of that I think is true. I just don't know, because I hate to say it, as soon as Hulk Hogan says something, you have to immediately fact check it.
Well, I can testify that there have been numerous celebrities, both on a local and national level, that get nervous and cold feet, and it was a good idea when they agreed to it and they thought they'd have fun, but now they actually got to do it, and oh shit, am I going to look like an idiot? I don't know how to do this, or this, somebody's going to hurt me. I've heard that. If we had a DJ that wanted to back out of a match with a girl here in OVW because Donna Daring, he said, she's not going to hurt me, is she? I said she could if she wanted to, but she doesn't want to, and she's not going to. But at the same time, I don't think he was going to fucking completely bail out of the building and take a cab, especially with he hadn't been paid yet.
You know, it's an interesting name they left out. They were showing the build-up, and I love so much of that. And again, this is a period of time I've researched that I find so interesting because Vince has the least amount of control he'll ever have until the very end, but still he makes it all come together. But there's so many parties, and David Wolf was pretty powerful at that point in terms of what he wanted to do and what he didn't want to do with wrestling. And Vince let all these things happen, and the wrestling album was being made, and it's an incredible way that he put it all together. But Jim, what I was going to say is the one thing they left out, they're showing everything with Cyndi Lauper. And she was, I mean, if you grew up today, you may not realize that she was the megastar right before Madonna.
Yeah. Oh, she was, I guess they like Taylor Swift and Miley Cyrus, and the kids are all up over Beyonce and all those people today, but Cyndi Lauper was bigger than all of them.
That's right, Beyonce, as you put it. But they show the lead up to the match, and then they show like a fake clipboard or whatever it was, and it's like the match, now we had it set. Roddy Piper, Paul Orndorff, Cowboy Bob Orton against Mr. T, Hulk Hogan, and Cyndi Lauper.
Cyndi Lauper, yeah.
Jimmy Snuka has become Cyndi Lauper in the history books now of WWE, ladies and gentlemen. Whenever you think of Jimmy Snuka, just say Cyndi Lauper.
Well, that's the thing. Nobody remembers Snuka was in the corner of Hulk Hogan and Mr. T in the main event at the first WrestleMania because Snuka was the biggest babyface of the previous era, of the Vince Sr. era that was still around. And they wanted Vince Jr., he didn't want to trust Snuka on the show, right? But he wanted Snuka's name and face out there, not only for the Garden Live House, but for the promotion. I mean, in 1982, Snuka was the most popular babyface in the professional wrestling business.
Well, in 1983, he was the year he went supernova, and that's right before Hogan came in. And, of course, when Hogan comes in 84, the three most popular wrestlers by far in the company, and depending on who you talk to, this may be the order. Jimmy Snuka, Sergeant Slaughter, Hulk Hogan. Because people forget Slaughter was the monster babyface, especially in the summer of 84. Hogan had no feud. Hogan was just touring as the world champion. He'll fight Big John Studd one night, Nikolai Volkov the next night. Slaughter and the Sheik was the feud. Snuka and Piper was the feud. So you had three different shows, one headlined by Snuka Piper, you had Slaughter and the Sheik, and then the Hulk Hogan show. But then that summer is when Snuka finally burned out completely and had to be sent away for the first time.
And as well, Pat Patterson was the referee, and they kind of alluded to on the show, Pat was there in case anybody tried to double cross Mr. T or whatever the fuck. Remember, Muhammad Ali was announced as the referee, but he was always going to be the guest referee outside the ring in a ceremonial position where he could come in and throw a few jabs at Piper or whatever. But Pat Patterson was the referee, not in case of a double cross, but basically in case Mr. T got lost and screwed everything up. You always tried to have, if you had, and I know there wasn't a lot of instances of singers or dancers or movie stars in, main event wrestling matches before this, but if you had a celebrity, crossover football player, boxer, anybody that wasn't an experienced wrestler, you tried to have a guy like Pat as the referee because he had so much experience and he was used to things going south and what to do with them, that was extra insurance that, this thing isn't going to turn into a turd. So I don't think it was much for a double cross because let's face it, Pat Patterson in the ring with Hulk Hogan, Paul Orndorff, Roddy Piper. Probably the only person he could beat in a shoot, Pat, was Mr. T. Because Pat wasn't a shooter. He wasn't a fucking, amateur standout or whatever, but he was a brilliant mind. So he could keep them on the right track and prevent things from going south. But again, then, they talked about after the show was over, the incredible publicity that he got afterwards, which then did more good for Vince, because now it's the crowing section. Whoa, look at this, wrestling's back again. And that's where, because the story that the WWF put out was, well, wrestling's been underground in smoky bars and second-rate halls for years now, but now we're making it clean and nice and drawing big crowds, and people believed that. Not the people that had been wrestling fans, because they knew that that was bullshit. They'd been going to see matches in these big arenas with these big crowds for years. But people who hadn't, the new audience, they just assumed that to be true because they hadn't been watching wrestling. They remember Gorgeous George in the 50s, network TV, if they were that old, or they might remember that their parents in New York watched Bruno or whatever. But to them, to the new audience from MTV and the action figures and all that stuff, they assumed, because they saw the lighting and they were told this by the newspaper, wow, this is a revamp of wrestling and it's now going to be bigger than ever. And that fed on itself to the point where now, 40 years later, people still believe that that was true. And between the merchandising and the cartoons and the ice cream bars, it was everywhere. And again, the people that knew the difference were the wrestling fans. But during the initial national expansion, the Northeast, the fans kept watching the WWF because they always had. And they picked up a lot of fans in the dead territories, California, Los Angeles, San Francisco, the Sheik's old territory, Michigan, Ohio, Midwest, certain places where the local territory didn't exist anymore or wasn't strong. And that was a bunch of new fans. So, it was one of the most successful promotions of any event in wrestling history, not as seamless as they would have had you see here or think here from this biography. But, it was a lot of work, a lot of luck, and the right people involved. And now 40 years later, that's, 40 years later, now WrestleMania is just, it's kind of like it's kind of like going to see the Harlem Globetrotters once a year. You go for the stadium, I guess, or watch on TV for the stadium and the atmosphere and the blah, blah, blah. The matches aren't as good as they were 20 years ago, but they're better than they were 40 years ago. Nobody really has a hot fucking feud anymore, but it's the thing now that it's the place to go. They've made it a destination thing for their annual really dedicated fan. But the original idea of WrestleMania was like the original idea of Starrcade or the original idea of any other territory big show they did every year. It was just to sell the most tickets we possibly can by culminating all of our angles or featuring all of our stars and trying to have a hot main event. So some things never change, but the aspect or the tone and tenor of the show does. WrestleMania,
a true history, a true documentary, a true book about this period of time, 82 to 85. You can go to 86 if you want, just that wrestling war period. Everything that happens from the moment Vince buys the company, when he gets full control of the company, and then by 84, the war is really on. By 85, it's still a war. By 86, it's over. Well, by the end of 86, 87, it's over.
That
Really,
was about
WrestleMania 3.
87.
WrestleMania
87.
3. WrestleMania 3 is kind of the death of everything else.
WrestleMania 3 does that house and that crowd, and meanwhile, Crockett's trying to buy other promotions and falls in a fucking hole he ain't going to get out of. 86, it was neck and neck. And never in terms of the business, as I've mentioned, in terms of the office staff or the infrastructure or the ways that the business were conducted. But ratings, crowd, talent, I think 86 was the closest. And then the chair started squeaking, and it was never the same after that.
That's right. Jace, take the chair out if you can. But
well, then what I said won't make any sense.
I want that. I want people to think you're nuts.
Okay, well, they think I'm crazy now. But if they stuck their hand a little deeper in my pocket, they'd think I was a little nuts.
I was thinking about calling some newsletter writers and planting some stories about you.
Well, you know, what you ought to do is just bet on the projections. That's what you ought to do.
What projections exactly?
Make some projections and then bet on them. Do I have to do everything around here?
I guess so.
I'll do the betting. You make the projections.
Oh, so I can make the projections right now.
If you want to, what would you like to project?
I would like to project, I guess for the sake of this spot here.
Yes.
It's really hard when you put someone on the spot to just make a fucking projection. I project that this week on Dynamite, there will be 4 matches that go at least through 1 commercial break.
Well, folks, you've just heard from one of the most talented projectionists in the entire movie industry. And I think he's projecting his confusion on the rest of us. But you know what they've done, Brian, is they've figured out a way that you can play against the projections instead of the other people, because other people may be smarter than you. I know we got a smart audience, but there may be some dumb dipshit out there that's stupider than owl shit slapped with a board, as Aunt Lola used to say. So what they do is they just let you pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than the Prize Picks projection, then you can win up to 10 times your money. Or it doesn't have to be scoring more. It could be any projection they have, and Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you watch: NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, PGA, football, basketball, soccer, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, MMA, boxing, Euro basketball, cricket, and the ever-popular disc golf. All those sports, entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It is that freaking easy for you to do. You can make safe and fast withdrawals. When you withdraw from Prize Picks, they actually have a security guard that stands over you and watches you in case somebody tries to come up from behind you and hit you over the head and steal your money.
You'll be taking your money out digitally. There'll be no one in the room unless you have them in the room. There'll be no security guard. You won't need one because it's not an ATM.
I thought you had to go down to the corner to the Prize Picks machine and take out your withdrawals. You can do it right from the comfort of your own home?
From your own phone, from your own home? Anything could be a Prize Pick machine.
Well, that's even safer. Well, then that security guard, you guys can just sit down and have a sandwich. You can. It's also, by the way, I want you to know that Prize Picks is currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. 20 states apparently have not gotten with the program as of yet, but we are trying. But right now, folks, what you need to do, download the Prize Picks app. However you do that. We've talked about apps before. I still know nothing about them. But you can also...
It's an easy thing that almost everyone who has a phone knows how to do. So don't worry, they'll know how to do it.
Well, hold on. Wait a minute. I got a phone right here. Hear that? That's a dial tone.
You don't have apps on those phones.
I'm calling somebody to ask if they've got an app on this phone. Hello? Hello? Never mind. I'll get back with them later. Anyway.
What the hell is this?
You can also go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports, because everybody wants a daily fantasy. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code JCE. If you put in 100, they will give you 100. If you put in 50, they'll give you 50. If you put in nothing, they'll give you the finger. Don't forget to enter the promo code JCE at sign up either on the Prize Picks app or at prizepicks.com, and you'll get that instant deposit match up to $100. And then write us an email and tell us how much money you won.
That's right. Or send us a check.
And that would be even better.